Thank you so much for attending my PowerPoint presentation on the entire life of Moses. Basket in the Nile. Pharaoh had a problem. The Israelite population was growing, and like any rational leader facing a demographic shift, he decided the appropriate response was infanticide. His decree was simple: kill every Hebrew male baby. Foolproof plan. What could possibly go wrong? Enter Jochebed, a woman from the tribe of Levi who had just given birth to a son. She hid the baby for 3 months, which is approximately 2 months and 29 days longer than you'd think a crying infant could remain hidden from a government actively searching for crying infants. When concealment became impossible, she constructed a waterproof basket from reeds, placed her son inside, and set him adrift in the Nile River, the same river, notably, where Egyptian children were being drowned. Her strategy was to fight fire with fire, apparently. Pharaoh's daughter found the basket while bathing. Upon discovering a Hebrew baby floating in the river during an act of genocide she herself must have known about, she decided to adopt him. The sister Miriam, who had been watching, helpfully suggested that a Hebrew woman could nurse the child. That Hebrew woman was, of course, the baby's actual mother. Moses spent his first 12 years with his biological family before transitioning to the palace, where he was raised as Egyptian royalty by the very dynasty that wanted him dead. Pharaoh's genocide prevention program was defeated by a basket. Truly inspired governance. Life as a prince of Egypt. Moses spent the next 40 years living in Pharaoh's palace, which is to say he experienced approximately 0% of the suffering endured by his actual people. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, trained in their customs, their literature, their military tactics. The biblical text describes him as mighty in words and deeds. The historian Josephus claims Moses became a general in the Egyptian army and led successful campaigns against the Ethiopians. So while the Hebrews were making bricks without straw, Moses was presumably learning advanced geometry and strategic warfare. Nothing says oppressed minority quite like being raised in a palace with unlimited resources. Moses had access to the finest education Egypt could offer, ate from golden plates, and commanded respect from Egyptian nobility. He lived this way for 4 decades. Meanwhile, the Israelites he was ethnically tied to were being worked to death in construction projects, their children still subject to Pharaoh's genocidal whims, their backs scarred from Egyptian whips. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. Moses knew he was Hebrew. His mother had 12 years to make sure of that. But he also knew what side his bread was buttered on, and that bread was very much buttered on the Egyptian royalty side. He watched his people suffer while he enjoyed every privilege their oppressors could provide. This internal contradiction would eventually manifest in spectacular fashion, but for now, Moses was content being the least oppressed member of an oppressed people. Next up is the moment everything fell apart: the killing of the taskmaster. At age 40, Moses apparently decided it was time to connect with his Hebrew roots. He witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and his response was immediate and permanent. He killed the Egyptian. This was Moses' first recorded attempt to help his people, and his strategy was homicide. Bold choice. Moses looked around to make sure no one was watching, then buried the body in the sand. Let that marinate for a second. He buried evidence of murder in sand, in a desert, where literally everything is sand and nothing stays buried for long because wind exists. This is the same man who was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which apparently did not include basic concepts in evidence disposal or why sand is a terrible hiding place. The murder became public knowledge almost immediately. The next day, when Moses tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews, one of them said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian? Congratulations. Your secret murder is now common knowledge among the exact people you thought you were helping." Pharaoh heard about it and sought to kill Moses, which makes sense because murder was frowned upon even when committed by adopted princes. Moses fled to Midian, transforming himself from privileged royalty into wanted fugitive in record time. One impulsive act of violence cost him everything: his status, his home, his cushy palace life, and the next 40 years of his existence. From prince to shepherd, the downgrade was severe. The burning bush. Moses spent the next 40 years as a shepherd in Midian, tending the flocks of Jethro, a priest whose daughter Zipporah Moses married. He had 2 sons during this period. The man who once commanded Egyptian armies now spent his days following sheep around a desert. The career trajectory was not impressive, but these These 40 years of obscurity taught Moses patience, which would prove absolutely essential for dealing with the Israelites, who would make sheep look like cooperative geniuses by comparison. At age 80, while shepherding on Mount Horeb, Moses encountered a bush that was on fire but not burning up. God spoke from the bush and delivered a job offer: return to Egypt and free the Israelites from slavery. Moses' response to the Almighty Creator of the universe, speaking from miraculous flames, was essentially, actually, have you considered someone else? His excuses were numerous and creative. Who am I to do this? He asked, as if God hadn't already considered that angle. What if they don't believe me? Valid concern, but God provided miraculous signs. I'm not eloquent, I'm slow of speech, Moses complained, which is biblical code for I stutter or I'm a terrible public speaker. God's patience was remarkable. He appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, to be the spokesman, because apparently even the creator of speech couldn't convince Moses he'd be fine. God revealed his name as I am who I am, which is simultaneously the most profound theological statement and the most frustrating non-answer ever given. Moses eventually agreed to go, but only after arguing with a burning bush for what must have been an embarrassingly long time. An 80-year-old reluctant stutterer would lead the Exodus. God's hiring criteria remain mysterious. The 10 plagues. Moses and Aaron returned to Egypt and confronted Pharaoh with a simple request: let the Israelites go. Pharaoh's response was no, which initiated a pattern that would repeat 9 more times with increasing absurdity. What followed were 10 plagues, each one targeting a specific Egyptian god to demonstrate that their entire pantheon was useless. Water to blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of every Egyptian firstborn. The pattern was predictable and Pharaoh still couldn't figure it out. Moses would warn him. The plague would happen. Pharaoh would promise to let the Israelites go. The plague would end. Pharaoh would immediately change his mind. Repeat. It's like watching someone touch a hot stove 10 times in a row, each time expressing shock that it burns. The Egyptian magicians deserve special recognition for making everything worse. When Aaron turned the Nile to blood, the magicians replicated the miracle, creating a second layer of blood. The river was already undrinkable, but they decided what Egypt really needed was more blood. When frogs covered the land, the magicians summoned additional frogs. The problem-solving skills were extraordinary. God hardened Pharaoh's heart multiple times, which raises theological questions we're not addressing in this presentation. The Israelites in Goshen were protected from most plagues, creating a clear distinction between God's people and everyone else. The plagues escalated in severity, from inconvenient to economically devastating to lethal. After 9 consecutive catastrophes, Pharaoh's advisors probably should have updated their resumes, or at least suggested that perhaps the God of the Hebrews was not someone to antagonize. But Pharaoh persisted, because apparently pattern recognition wasn't part of Egyptian royal education. It would take the death of his own son to finally convince him. The first Passover. God announced the 10th and final plague. At midnight, every firstborn in Egypt would die, from Pharaoh's son to the firstborn of cattle. Nothing says, let my people go, quite like the mass death of children. Subtle, it was not, but 9 previous catastrophes had failed to convince Pharaoh. So apparently, escalation to infanticide was the only remaining option. The Israelites received specific instructions. Each household was to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorframes with its blood. The angel of death would pass over these marked houses, sparing the inhabitants. They were to eat the lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, dressed and ready to leave immediately, because there would be no time for bread to rise. The meal was practical. The symbolism would become foundational to Jewish identity for millennia. At midnight, it happened. Every Egyptian firstborn died, from the palace to the prison. Pharaoh's own son was not spared, which one might argue was the logical consequence of repeatedly ignoring divine warnings. But the grief was real and immediate. A cry went up throughout Egypt that had never been heard before and would never be heard again. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and essentially screamed at them to leave, to take everything and everyone and go. The Egyptians were so terrified and eager to see the Israelites gone that they gave them whatever they asked for: gold, silver, clothing. The Israelites basically robbed Egypt on their way out, though calling it robbery seems generous given 400 years of unpaid slave labor. Approximately 600,000 men, plus women and children, likely over 2 million people total, left Egypt that night. They took Joseph's bones with them, fulfilling an ancient promise. Pharaoh had finally learned his lesson. The Israelites were free. Or so they thought. Pharaoh would have one more terrible idea before this was over: the parting of the Red Sea. Pharaoh changed his mind. Again, after watching his entire country devastated by 10 supernatural plagues, after losing his firstborn son, after literally begging the Israelites to leave in the middle of the night, Pharaoh decided that actually he wanted his slaves back. He mobilized 600 of Egypt's best chariots and pursued them into the wilderness. The man's capacity for poor decision making was genuinely impressive. The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. Their response was immediate panic and complaints. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? They asked Moses. These are the same people who had just witnessed 10 plagues, including the parting of a river's worth of blood and the death of every Egyptian firstborn. Short-term memory issues, apparently. Moses told them to stand firm and watch God's deliverance. A pillar of cloud and fire positioned itself between the Israelites and the Egyptians, separating them. Then Moses stretched out his staff over the sea, and God sent a strong east wind that blew all night long. The crossing happened in darkness, not the daylight depicted in every painting. The sea parted, creating walls of water on both sides, and the seabed became dry land. The Israelites began crossing. It took hours for over 2 million people to traverse on foot. The Egyptians, witnessing a sea literally split in half by supernatural intervention, decided the logical course of action was to follow them in. Pharaoh watched walls of water held back by divine power and thought, yeah, I can drive chariots through that. Bold strategy. The Egyptian army pursued into the seabed, but God caused their chariot wheels to stick and fall off. Panic set in. They realized too late that they were fighting against God himself. Moses stretched out his hand again. The walls of water collapsed. The entire Egyptian army drowned in seconds, their bodies washing ashore as evidence. Not one survived. The Israelites sang the song of the sea in celebration. Their freedom was now permanent and undeniable. The 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. God announced he would descend upon the mountain in 3 days, and the people needed to consecrate themselves and prepare because his presence was dangerous. When the day arrived, the mountain was covered in smoke and fire. The earth shook violently, and the sound of a trumpet grew impossibly loud. Thunder and lightning filled the sky. The spectacle was so absolutely terrifying that the people begged Moses to be their intermediary. Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, they said, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. God descended in fire and thunder on a shaking mountain, and the people thought, maybe we should get someone else to talk to him. Reasonable assessment, actually. God spoke the 10 Commandments directly to the assembled Israelites first, his voice booming across the camp. Then Moses ascended the mountain to receive further instruction. He stayed there for 40 days and 40 nights without eating or drinking, which is either a miracle or severe dehydration, possibly both. During this time, God wrote the commandments on 2 stone tablets with his own finger, not dictated, not inscribed by Moses. God personally wrote them. The tablets were made of sapphire or lapis lazuli, approximately 20 inches square and 10 inches thick. According to rabbinic tradition, the words were bored completely through the stone, not simply engraved on the surface. These commandments formed the covenant between God and Israel, establishing moral and religious law. Different religious traditions number them differently. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all divide the 17 verses into 10 commandments in distinct ways, which has led to centuries of theological discussion that we're not getting into here. Moses also received extensive additional laws and instructions for building the tabernacle, the priesthood, and proper worship. The tablets would eventually be placed in the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israelite religion. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because Moses was about to discover that 40 days was far too long to leave the Israelites unsupervised. He fasted for 40 days on a mountain to receive laws the people would break before he even descended. The timing was spectacularly unfortunate. While Moses was on the summit receiving the command, "You shall have no other gods before me," the Israelites were at the base of the mountain doing exactly that. Whoops, the golden calf. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," the Israelites at the base of the mountain decided to get a head start on violating it. The people waited 40 whole days before deciding to worship a cow. Truly exceptional patience. They approached Aaron and demanded, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Notice they called Moses this fellow, as if he were some random guy they vaguely remembered, rather than the man who had led them through 10 plagues in a parted sea approximately 3 months earlier. Aaron's response was not, Absolutely not. Are you insane? But rather, sure, give me your gold earrings. He collected jewelry from everyone, melted it down, and fashioned a golden calf. He then proclaimed, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt," which is objectively false because a statue he made 5 minutes ago did not bring anyone out of anywhere. Aaron built an altar before the calf and declared the next day a festival to the Lord, because apparently mixing idolatry with Yahweh worship seemed like a good compromise. The people offered sacrifices and then engaged in pagan revelry, which is biblical code for orgies. God informed Moses what was happening and threatened to destroy the entire nation. Moses interceded, pleading for mercy. Then he descended the mountain carrying the stone tablets God had personally inscribed. When he saw the calf and the dancing, he became so enraged that he threw down the tablets, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. The symbolism was not subtle. They had broken the covenant before Moses could even deliver it. Moses burned the golden calf, ground it to powder, mixed it with water, and forced the Israelites to drink it. The punishment was both humiliating and probably unpleasant. He then asked, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The Levites rallied to him, and Moses ordered them to go through the camp with swords. About 3,000 people died that day. When Moses confronted Aaron, his brother's defense was, "I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf," which is the ancient equivalent of "it wasn't me," and an obvious lie. The text had already stated Aaron fashioned it with a tool. Aaron wasn't severely punished and later became the high priest, which raises questions about accountability we're not addressing here. Next up is the consequence of all this rebellion: the 40 years in the wilderness. The Israelites finally reached Kadesh Barnea, the southern border of Canaan. They were literally at the edge of the promised land. The journey from Egypt could have taken as little as 11 days by the direct route, but they had taken the long way to avoid the Philistines. Now, after approximately 2 years of travel, they stood ready to enter. Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout the land for 40 days. The spies returned with evidence that the land was indeed flowing with milk and honey. They brought back a cluster of grapes so large it required 2 men to carry it on a pole. So far, excellent news. But 10 of the 12 spies delivered a terrifying report. The inhabitants were giants, the cities were fortified, and conquest was impossible. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them," they said. Only Joshua and Caleb disagreed, insisting we should go up and take possession of the land. "For we can certainly do it." The people believed the majority. They saw giants and fortified cities and immediately forgot the 10 plagues, the parted Red Sea, the pillar of fire, the manna from heaven, and every other supernatural demonstration of God's power they had witnessed in the past 2 years. Goldfish memory, apparently. They wept, complained, and declared they would rather return to Egypt or choose a new leader to take them back into slavery. God's patience finally reached its limit. He declared that none of that generation, everyone aged 20 and older, would enter the promised land. The punishment was proportional and poetic. 1 year of wilderness wandering for each day the spies explored the land. 40 days equals 40 years. Only Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful spies, would live to enter Canaan. The 10 pessimistic spies died immediately by plague. Congratulations. You turned an 11-day journey into a 40-year camping trip. Navigation goals achieved. The Israelites were condemned to wander the desert until that entire rebellious generation died off. What could have been weeks in the wilderness became 4 decades. They would eat manna, follow the pillar of cloud and fire, and watch their friends and family die in the sand, one by one, year after year, until the last person who had refused to trust God was gone. Moses himself would not enter the promised land, though for different reasons. Later, at Meribah, he would strike a rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God commanded, and that single act of disobedience would cost him entry into Canaan. Even the leader who had faithfully brought them this far would die outside the land of promise. The short way became the long way. The easy path became impossible, and an entire generation paid the price for refusing to believe that the God who had delivered them from Egypt could deliver them into Canaan. Death on Mount Nebo. Moses was 120 years old. His eyes were still clear, his strength undiminished. By all physical measures, he could have led the Israelites into Canaan and lived to see the conquest completed, but he would not enter the promised land. And the reason was a single moment of disobedience. At Meribah, the Israelites had complained about lack of water again, and God instructed Moses to speak to a rock to bring forth water. Moses, after 40 years of leading whiny, rebellious people through a desert, lost his temper. He struck the rock twice with his staff instead of speaking to it. Water came out. The people drank. And God told Moses that because of this act, he would not enter the land he had spent 4 decades journeying toward. One moment of anger cost him the promised land. The grading rubric was unforgiving. God commanded Moses to ascend Mount Nebo, also called Pisgah, in the land of Moab, directly across from Jericho. From the summit, God showed him a panoramic view of the entire promised land. Moses saw everything from Gilead in the north to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, stretching to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev desert in the south, and the valley of Jericho with its palm trees extending to Zor. The view was comprehensive and clear. God said, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses led rebellious people for 40 years, and his reward was, "You can look, but you can't touch." The irony was not lost on anyone. Moses died there on Mount Nebo in Moab, exactly as the Lord had said. God himself buried Moses in a valley opposite Beth Peor, and to this day, no one knows where his grave is located. The hidden burial site prevents idolatry, which, given Israel's track record with golden calves, was probably wise planning. The Israelites mourned for Moses for 30 days. Joshua, son of Nun, succeeded Moses and led the people across the Jordan River into Canaan. The generation that had refused to enter was dead. A new generation, born in the wilderness, would inherit the promise their parents had rejected. Moses' life divided perfectly into 3 40-year periods: 40 years as a prince in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd in Midian, and 40 years as a leader in the wilderness. He never entered the land he had worked toward, never saw the fulfillment of the promise, never experienced the rest he had led others to find. Despite this, he is remembered as Israel's greatest prophet, the man who spoke with God face to face, the lawgiver who established the covenant, the deliverer who brought them out of Egypt. In conclusion, Moses' life demonstrates that faithful service does not exempt one from consequences, and leadership of difficult people will cost you everything, including the thing you want most, and you should absolutely read about him. If you enjoyed this PowerPoint presentation, I made others, and you should absolutely check them out. Peace on planet Earth.